In the summer of 1948, Harry S. Truman faced a decision that could quietly slide the world into another catastrophic war, or redefine how power would be used in the nuclear age. Berlin was starving. Not metaphorically, not politically, literally. More than 2 million civilians sat trapped deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, surrounded on all sides by Red Army territory. Every rail line into the city had been cut, every canal sealed, every road blocked. Coal deliveries had stopped. Food shipments had vanished. Electricity flickered. Hospitals rationed power. Children were already losing weight. And Joseph Stalin was watching. This wasn't a battlefield. There were no tanks rolling, no shots fired, no declarations issued. This was something far colder. A pressure test. A calculated squeeze to see how far the United States was willing to go to defend territory it technically didn't even own. Inside the White House, Truman understood something most of his advisors didn't fully grasp yet. If Berlin fell, Europe might follow. The Second World War had barely ended 3 years earlier. Germany lay shattered, cities flattened, borders redrawn, millions displaced. The uneasy alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had evaporated almost overnight, replaced by suspicion, rivalry, and silent positioning. Berlin had become the fault line. The city sat like an island, split into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, despite being more than 100 miles inside Soviet-controlled territory. On paper, agreements allowed access routes. In reality, those agreements meant nothing if Stalin chose to ignore them. By June 1948, that's exactly what he did. The Soviets shut everything down. At first, American commanders assumed it was temporary, a bureaucratic dispute, a pressure tactic to force concessions over German currency reforms. Truman was told it would blow over. It didn't. Within days, it became obvious this was a deliberate blockade, a slow-motion siege designed to force the Western Allies out without firing a single shot. And Truman was furious. He had lived through appeasement in the 1930s. He had watched democracies flinch, retreat, and rationalize their way into disaster. He had inherited the presidency during the final months of global war and authorized the most devastating weapons ever created. He was not about to be bullied now. But the problem was this: every traditional response led toward war. Sending armed convoys down blocked highways would almost certainly provoke Soviet forces. Reopening rail lines by force would mean direct clashes. Airlifting supplies to an entire city of millions sounded impossible, borderline absurd by the standards of the time. The Pentagon's early estimates were grim. Berlin needed thousands of tons of food and fuel every single day just to survive. Aircraft of the era were slow, limited, and vulnerable. Air corridors were narrow. Weather over Germany was unpredictable. Winter was coming. One senior advisor reportedly dismissed the idea outright, calling it a publicity stunt that would collapse within weeks. Stalin expected exactly that. He believed the Americans would blink. Inside the Oval Office, Truman asked a simple question that cut through every technical briefing. What happens if we leave? The answer was devastating. Berlin would fall entirely under Soviet control. German confidence in the West would collapse. France and Italy, already politically fragile, might swing toward communist parties. The Marshall Plan could unravel. America's credibility, its promise to defend democratic Europe, would be exposed as hollow. Truman saw it clearly. This wasn't about Berlin alone. This was about whether the United States would stand its ground without reaching for war. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor in Germany, proposed a dangerous alternative: send a small armed convoy and dare the Soviets to fire first. Clay believed Stalin would back down. Truman rejected it. He knew how accidents start wars. Instead, another idea, initially whispered, then cautiously discussed, began to take shape. What if they flew everything in? At first, it sounded insane. Cargo planes landing every few minutes, day and night, carrying food, coal, medicine, fuel. No weapons, no confrontation, just relentless logistics. If the Soviets interfered, they would have to openly shoot down unarmed aircraft carrying food to civilians. That would expose them. Truman liked that. The Air Force ran the numbers again. It was barely feasible, but only if everything went right. Pilots would have to fly precise routes with no deviation. Maintenance crews would need to work around the clock. Air traffic control would need to be reinvented on the fly. One mistake could cascade into disaster. And still, it might fail. Late one night, Truman reviewed the final briefings. There was no dramatic speech, no televised address, no pounding of desks. He simply said the words that locked the world into a new kind of conflict. We stay. With that, the Berlin airlift was approved. If you're enjoying these deep dives into the moments that shaped the Cold War, take 1 second to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. The first flights began almost immediately. C-47s and C-54s lifted off loaded with powdered milk, flour, dried vegetables, and coal. Pilots flew narrow air corridors agreed upon years earlier, corridors the Soviets still technically recognized. Stalin didn't interfere, at first. He watched. He waited for the operation to collapse under its own weight. It didn't. Within weeks, flight schedules tightened. Planes landed every few minutes at Tempelhof Airport. When Tempelhof filled up, a new airfield was carved out of the ground in record time. Tegel, built largely by German civilians working around the clock. Coal dust coated everything, engines roared non-stop, pilots barely slept. Still, the planes kept coming. What shocked even American planners was the psychological effect. Berliners didn't panic. They watched the skies. Children began counting planes instead of ration coupons. Pilots started dropping small parachutes with candy for kids, an unofficial gesture that became legendary. Stalin had expected fear. Instead, he got resolve. By autumn, the airlift was delivering more supplies than Berlin had received before the blockade. Efficiency improved. Aircraft were unloaded in minutes. Damaged planes were repaired at unbelievable speed. And crucially, no shots were fired. The Soviets buzzed aircraft, jammed radios, applied pressure. But they never crossed the line, because Truman had boxed them in. If Stalin escalated, he would look like the aggressor starving civilians. If he backed down, he would lose face. The longer the airlift continued, the weaker his position became. Winter hit hard. Ice formed on runways, fog grounded flights. Coal shortages returned briefly. Critics resurfaced, warning Truman that the operation was unsustainable. Truman didn't waver. He understood something deeper than logistics. Every day the airlift continued was a message. The United States would not abandon its commitments, even when doing so was expensive, exhausting, and dangerous. Behind closed doors, Soviet leadership began to argue. The blockade had failed to fracture the Western alliance. Instead, it had unified it. In May 1949, without fanfare, the Soviets lifted the blockade. No announcement, no apology, just a quiet reopening of routes. The airlift continued for months afterward, just in case. By the time it ended, more than 2 million tons of supplies had been delivered. Not by force, by persistence. The Berlin airlift changed the Cold War's trajectory. It proved power didn't always require weapons. It showed restraint could be strategic. It turned Berlin into a symbol, not of weakness, but of endurance. And it cemented Truman's legacy in a way few decisions ever do. He had faced a moment where every option carried risk, where fear whispered that backing down would be easier, where escalation beckoned as the quicker path. Instead, he chose something harder. He chose to stay. And if you want more true stories like this, make sure you're subscribed and let me know what moment you want covered next.